Hi everyone, and welcome to Germination Retail Roundtable webinar, where we are exploring the topic of technological disruption in seed. My name is Mark Zinkowitz, and I serve as the editor for Germination, and today I'm happy to be your host. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, 2020 Seed Labs, Canterra Seeds, and CCAN for their support. As we go along, I invite you to share your thoughts and insight on Twitter using the hashtag #SeedRetail. I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on germination.ca following the event. During the presentations, you'll likely have some questions for our speakers. Please type these in the chat box and we'll address them during the Q&A sessions we'll hold after each speaker finishes. Today's first speaker is Doug Miller, who is responsible for certification and technology services for the Canadian Seed Growers Association. Doug manages CSGA's seed crop certification program and related IT support services. He works closely with seed growers and the seed industry to provide ongoing operational support and guidance on certification and related issues. Doug will introduce us to the topic of disruption and how seed comes into play. Doug, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about disruption. We can go ahead and switch slides there. So whenever we hear the word disruption, we often associate it with Silicon Valley or tech startups. However, disruption innovation is not a label, but rather a theory. The term disruptive innovation was coined by Clayton Christensen's 1997 article entitled The Innovator's Dilemma. Since this time, the phrase disruptive innovation has become a business buzzword during the ranks of things like synergy, deep dive, and bleeding edge. The chart that you're seeing in front of you shows the increased use of the term disruptive innovation and disruptive technology over time. The word disruptive innovation has actually been so overused over the last number of years that Christensen had to come back in 2015 to write another article on the topic, hoping to curb its misuse. So what actually is disruptive innovation? As per Christensen's theory, disruptive innovation occurs when a smaller company with fewer resources can unseat an established business. Think David versus Goliath. The smaller company, switch sides there, Mark, sorry. The smaller company is able to achieve disruptive innovation by targeting segments of the marketplace that have been neglected by the larger company. This typically happens because the larger company is focused on the more profitable areas of their business and improving products or service for the most demanding of their customers. When this happens, this new entrant or this smaller company is able to gain a foothold at the bottom of the market, or they tap into a new market that the existing business has failed to notice. The new company is able to attract the overlooked customers of the bigger company with a new or innovative technology that is better suited for their needs, usually at a lower price point. Once this occurs, the new company then moves steadily up the market until it is able to deliver a product that the mainstream customer expects, while keeping intact the advantages that made it successful in the first place. Think innovation and price. It is through this process that disruption occurs. Lower quality offerings that enter at the bottom of the market, which gradually then become mainstream, displacing established business or products. Now, one thing to note is that the existing company might not be getting disrupted because it's failing to innovate. In many cases, the larger company is still innovating, but just at a different level, which in the industry they call sustaining innovation. Next slide. One textbook example of innovation is Blockbuster versus Netflix. As a kid, the highlight of my week was going to Blockbuster on Friday night to rent the latest movie on VHS. It was a staple in my life. Fast forward to 2018, most teenagers nowadays have no idea what Blockbuster is, but they do know what Netflix is. Here's what happened. At its peak, Blockbuster employed approximately 60,000 people, had 9,000 locations, and a valuation of $8 billion. In Christensen's model, Blockbuster is the established company. Now, enter our new entrant, Netflix. In the late 1990s, Netflix launched a mail-in subscription service. Netflix knew that it couldn't compete head-to-head with Blockbuster, so it looked towards a new technology, video streaming, as its innovation and competitive advantage. Netflix was able to offer a low-cost, on-demand, all-you-can-watch service. In doing so, they were able to tap into a new market, one that wasn't being serviced by Blockbuster. Quickly, Netflix became mainstream and is now embedded into many of our daily lives. For me, I watch Netflix all the time. I can't, like, the whole thing about Blockbuster and what happened there, to me, is still pretty crazy. But it's a textbook example. Next slide. Another example of disruptive innovation is Toyota. When Toyota entered the North American market, it was dominated by the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler. At that time, the big three were focused on making cars that were bigger, faster, safer, and more comfortable. Toyota went the other way. Instead, it released the model that you see in front of you. It was lighter, not as comfy, smaller, not as safe, and it was cheap. Toyota was targeting the market that the big three was overlooking. As a result, they created a new market by making cars more affordable to all. Now, fast forward to today, Toyota is very much a mainstream car company, so they've moved themselves up into the market. However, with new entrants such as Hyundai and Kia, will Toyota also get disrupted moving forward? Next slide. Now, whenever you talk about disruptive technology, the names of Uber and Tesla always come up. Now ask yourself the question, by Christensen's definition, are these companies truly disruptive? The answer is not really, and here's why. About Tesla, Christensen's model is all about moving from the bottom of the market and working your way up. Tesla started by offering top-end cars. It is now only recently that they are starting to move downstream into the market, making their cars more mainstream with the newest models. About Uber. Again, Uber didn't start at the bottom of the market. Instead, they focused at the mainstream, targeting customers who already used cabs. With that being said, I think that we can all agree that these are truly innovative companies, but not disruptive. Next slide. When I think about true disruption / innovation within the seed sector, I can't help but think about emerging plant breeding techniques, especially CRISPR-Cas9. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical side of this technology today. However, I'll touch briefly on how I think it could be a disruptor within the seed industry. CRISPR has the potential to be faster, more precise, and less expensive than traditional or transgenic breeding techniques. One article that I've read compared it to a nail gun versus a hammer and nail. So stepping back a little bit, what you have is essentially a tool that could allow smaller companies, universities, and smaller breeding institutions with fewer resources to try to target a market segment that is currently neglected by the existing marketplace. So an example would be, you could have a new breeding institution using CRISPR-Cas9 to create a new variety of soybeans for a small part of the market at a lower price than what traditionally could be on the market. Over time, this breeding institution could translate this new market into new products, thereby becoming more mainstream, moving upwards into the market. Now, this is just a theoretical example and an oversimplistic view of things. There are a lot of things that need to happen before CRISPR-Cas9 can start to truly be used, like how the technology will be regulated. Next slide, please. So just because something is not technically a disruptive innovation, that doesn't mean it's not going to impact you or your business, because it will. Here are a few technologies that I've been following that I think will start to appear in your daily lives or your business within the next few years. The first one is robotic process automation. This is essentially using computer bots to do routine tasks or work for you. At CSGA, we rely on robotic process automation to handle all of our routine tasks and power our electronic business workflows. So as an organization, about 4 years ago, we made the investment into this field, and now we're able to deliver on our key result areas weeks faster than what we were doing before without robotic process automation. Another area that I see coming on the horizon is private blockchains. Now, I could give a whole talk on blockchain, but for today, I want to plant the seed of private business blockchains in your mind. Now, these are outside the Bitcoin noise that you hear about. They have tremendous opportunity for traceability and transparency within the supply chain. At CSGA, this is a technology that we're looking at and how we can start playing in this field in order to, again, tap into the traceability and transparency tools that it provides. Now, the next item is about chatbots. A lot of companies are starting to move towards chatbots to handle routine business customer support transactions. These are gaining increasingly in popularity whenever they're linked to artificial or AI intelligent software programs out there such as like IBM's Watson. Gartner predicts that the average person will have more conversations with chatbots than their spouse by 2020. That's pretty huge. Last but not least, the continual adoption of IoT, which is the Internet of Things. We're talking here about sensors, virtual assistants, and the like. I feel that as the seed industry, there's a lot of growth and a lot of emerging companies that are in this space, and there's going to be a lot of really good innovation coming out of these areas. So that is my presentation for today. If you have any questions, I think they're going to be opening up the line now.
Thank you so much, Doug. Yes, we are indeed opening up the floor for some questions. If you have a question for Doug, please type it into the chat box now. We'll begin with a short Q&A portion of our webinar before we move to our next speaker. Doug, first question. I've heard a lot about blockchain lately and that we might be able to make use of it in the seed industry. What privacy and cost considerations might come into play if our industry was actually to do this?
Yeah, so blockchain is a new emerging technology. However, it's not a really new technology in itself. It's been around for over 10 years. So in the seed industry, how this technology could be used is tracing assets throughout the value chain. There is high potential for value creation mechanisms to be embedded within the smart contracts. Privacy concerns, obviously top of mind for everyone. I think what we need to realize with these, with the blockchain, it's not the cryptocurrency kind of blockchains that we're talking about. This is creating business ecosystems where players are only invited to the system. There's encryptions. Not all data is shared between all of the participants within the blockchain. So data, confidentiality, and how that data is used are all going to be really important discussions as we move this blockchain discussion forward. But I think that even though there are some concerns, the value will outweigh those concerns. In the seed industry, we talk about seed being the building block for the ag industry. As other industries start to look at blockchains within their industries and how they can be used in their supply chains, there's going to be an opportunity to link up the seed blockchain to other blockchains, for example, like IP soybeans or anything like that, just to be able to facilitate information, but again, with the sole purpose of traceability and transparency throughout the value chain.
Still on blockchain, Doug, how would that work in a non-identity preserved commodity value chain?
Yeah, so for example, like in the seed industry, there are multiple players. There's CSGA, there's CSI, and right now these organizations are treated kind of in silos. Information really isn't being stored, but there could be a private business blockchain that could be created between the two organizations to allow data to kind of flow between the data points to flow between the two organizations. For example, CSGA has crop certificate numbers, but CSI, with the roles with the registered seed establishments, they control lot numbers. And so just bringing those two data points together can provide a lot of value to the system. So that's an example of how it could work in like a non-IP soybean system. So just like kind of like on the seed side of things before it kind of gets out of the certified seed world.
Do you have any advice for how I can encourage innovation in my retail organization?
Yeah, innovation in your retail organization. For me, where I get a lot of my innovative ideas, I say that in air quotes, but it's all about keeping an eye on what other industries are doing. There's a lot of radical new ideas being proposed in financial technology, medical technology, and so it's just looking at how those innovations are operating within those kind of environments, and then saying, okay, how can I incorporate that into my business? So robotic process automation, automated workflows and all that, that's something that we've taken from more of a records management kind of industry and brought that into our seed organization. So again, my recommendation would just be outward looking to see what's happening out in other industries and how they can be kind of applicable to your organization.
Can you provide, Doug, a few examples of process automation?
Yeah, so let's say, for example, that so for an organization, basically our whole application process is is automated. So grower will come in, will make an application to our system. The application will come in. We'll take a quick look at it to make sure everything's right. But then the robotic process automations that happen in the background, they'll send it to the inspection service that will wait for them to interact with it. And then once they interact with it, it might send an email to someone else or do something somewhere else. It's basically just automating, teaching the computer systems to do routine tasks over and over and over and over and over again. That's what it is in a nutshell.
Sure. How can we guard against low-price online retailers who may be willing to sacrifice quality to reduce price?
Yeah, so in Christensen's model, they kind of talk about ways that established companies can kind of fend off like disruptive innovation. And essentially what it comes down to is finding ways to compete, maybe not as your signature brand, but maybe alternative brands to be able to compete within those marketplaces, to be able to offer the innovative solutions to maybe your overlooked customer segments. Because what they're doing is they're going after the people that you might not be focusing all of your attention on. So they're going after what you're forgetting about. So what his recommendations are is to maybe create a different unit that is looking at these kind of underserved markets.
With blockchain and bots, do organizations like CSGA and CSI become obsolete?
No, I don't think they become obsolete. I think that the value of these kind of organizations as kind of like monitors of the system becomes even more valuable. Just throwing something, saying, oh, you're gonna have a blockchain, isn't the magic bullet. It's about how you use the blockchain and how these systems are running. So it's just saying you're gonna have a blockchain or have a robot do it. There's a lot more to the service offerings of those two organizations than just pushing paper.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Our next speaker will be Erin Armstrong of Canterra Seeds. She's the Director of Industry and Regulatory Affairs for Canterra Seeds. She's responsible for trade and license agreements, intellectual property protection, and regulatory issues. She served for 2 years as the inaugural CEO of Limagrain Cereals Research Canada. She's going to talk a bit about value creation and how we can use it as a tool to protect seed in a disruptive world. Take it away, Erin.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everybody. My first slide here, the title slide, I started with the title that was in the notice that went out to everybody about registering for this session, and you can see that I altered it a little bit for the purpose of my comments. And rather than how do we protect seed from technological disruption, what I want to talk about is sort of shifting that focus to how do we prepare seed for technological disruption. Now, on this next slide, some of this is, this is really just sort of a different take on some of the stuff that Doug just talked about. And as I was searching the concept of disruption and innovation and all the rest of that in preparation for this webinar, I came across a link to a very short article. It was on Forbes from 2013, and really it was meant as an introduction to that year's list of top disruptors, and so that's already 5 years ago. But in reading the introduction to that, there are a few comments that really jumped out at me, and I've captured those here. And the article references again Clayton Christensen, which Doug just talked about, So the first point I've captured here: disruptors are innovators, but not all innovators are disruptors. So that's like saying, apples are fruit, but not all fruit is an apple. And I think Doug talked about some of the distinctions between disruptors and innovators. A disruption displaces an existing market, industry, or technology and produces something new and more efficient and worthwhile. And again, the context of the comment is really quite positive. And then finally, no single business model or sector are off limits to raw bursts of change, or in other words, to disruption or innovation. Now, I want to just briefly reference two industries which have been disrupted and that we consider in general maybe to have been disrupted, and sort of link that then into our move into a discussion about value creation. And the two examples you can see there, I've got the retail example of Amazon and the taxi service example of Uber. And a lot of the discussions sort of acknowledging what Doug just said about whether these are truly disruptive or not. They're certainly innovative. The point I really want to make on this slide is that even with disruption or even after disruption, there can be an incorporation of more traditional models of doing a particular business for at least part of that business. So in other words, a disrupted model is not mutually exclusive with the models of whatever business, whatever sector that we're currently familiar with. And if you think of Amazon, which last year purchased Whole Foods, so bricks and mortar operation, and they've announced that they're building bookstores, of all things. The first thing we think of when we think of Amazon is buying books online, and they're actually in the process of setting up a chain of bookstores. And then with Uber and the disruption to traditional local taxi services, being based in Winnipeg and familiar with the debates that have gone on here over the last year or so, as the city prepares for Uber to potentially arrive here, and debates about whether or not they should be following the same rules as taxi, paying the same sorts of insurance, and so on. When I was driving to work yesterday or the day before, on the radio, somebody was talking about a new Uber-type company, and I didn't catch the name, preparing to move into some markets. And they're not even engaging in those battles. They've just applied apparently for the permits that they need. They're going to have a different model, but they're just accepting that they have to fit within a particular regulatory framework. And so again, to me that was interesting because you have this new way of doing something, but acknowledging the traditional approach that will have to be accepted for at least part of how they operate. Now, in terms of value creation, we can look at this in multiple ways. First off, as innovative products are produced, not all innovation will actually make it to market. Excuse me. If value is not perceived for a particular innovation, it's simply not going to be adopted. And the other aspect is that there needs to be an effective mechanism for that innovative product, whatever it is, to reach market and to be adopted. So we have to keep that in mind. The second point here, I've been deeply involved, along with many others over the last couple of years, in what we called value creation discussions, and looking specifically at developing a recommended model for a comprehensive royalty collection system for cereals to ensure not only continued investment in the development of new varieties, but increased investment in the development of new value-added cereal varieties for Canada. Over the last few days, earlier this week, I was at a couple of different meetings and had a variety of discussions with a range of different producers last week as well. And one of them there were many interesting comments made, but one of them said, I don't want to be able to produce more wheat. I want to be able to produce a higher value wheat. And so, again, how do we ensure that the investment continues and increases so so that programs, whether they're public or private or large or small, continue to be able to develop new varieties of wheat or other cereals for the benefit of Canadian producers and the customers of the products that are produced. Another initiative that's been going on also for the last couple of years, which is referred to as seed synergy, and that discussion is becoming more widespread now as well. And this is 6 organizations, including CSGA, and we just heard from Doug, there are 5 other organizations as well, and they've been looking very closely at what makes the most sense in terms of how these organizations and the services that they provide to the seed sector, what makes sense in today's world and as we look forward into the future. So again, potential significant change there in how that part of our sector operates. New crop types I've got there with a question mark, distribution of acres, everything as we consider the international production of different crop types and where we fit into that, climate change and all of that, value-added processing, whether it's domestic or international, and on and on and on, and trying to figure out and look forward, whether it's from the breeding side, the seed company side, the retail side, what's the future? What are the crops that are going to be grown here? What is the proportion of acres going to be distributed among the various crops? And then the last point I've got here, virtual seed companies. I've got 2 question marks there. Now, there is a model already in place in the US, and it's in the process of moving here to Canada. And I think we all need to be aware of that and watching that, trying to figure out what the implications are, and whether or not, how that's going to work and how it's going to impact whatever we do, whatever part of the value chain that we operate in. And just my last slide here, progress versus a problem. And that refers back to the change I made in my title slide. So rather than looking at disruption as something that we have to be concerned about or protect ourselves from, we need to look at it as something to expect, to embrace, and to contribute to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erin. If you have questions for Erin, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll now have another quick Q&A session before we move on to our final speaker of the day. Erin, can you recap how the value creation model helps drive innovation?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to that investment piece. So value creation in the context of those discussions we've been having, I'm referring to specifically here, but in order to ensure that Canada continues to have domestically based breeding programs, developing varieties for Canada, we need to ensure that investment continues to happen in that, and ideally that investment increases, and that then will allow for continued development of new technologies, the application of those technologies for the benefit of growers and their customers by continuing to develop new value-added varieties.
Another question, Erin. I have never heard of virtual seed companies. Can you explain this concept a little more?
Yeah, and I have I don't have a detailed familiarity with it, but my understanding is there is a company set up in the US, which I think just over the last year or two, and they are, I think activities to date have primarily been on the input side. However, there's talk about seed being part of what they deal with as well. And whereas, today a producer would go to a retail outlet or possibly directly to a seed grower with pedigreed seed, that they could contact this entity and then be matched up with a provider of whatever they're looking for in their geography. So almost like a matchmaking service is my understanding of it. So no bricks and mortar again, really electronic exchanges, and yeah, just a different way of sourcing seed than has traditionally been done.
Erin, as you know, a large percentage of investment in the seed industry is in corn, soybeans, and canola. How can we maybe encourage more value creation for other smaller crops in Canada?
Yeah, and again, we go back to the value creation discussions that were going on formally under a working group for about a year and a half, from April 2016 through November of last year. And those discussions continue now around many tables in many companies and organizations, and also as part of that seed synergy discussion. And, you know, looking at two models were actually put forward at a relatively high level, and then having discussions around, okay, if we were to apply a model based on one of these two versions, and apply it in Canada to ensure that we had a more comprehensive royalty collection system for cereals. The crops you referred to, corn, soybeans, canola, canola and corn are hybrids for the most part. All three of those crops for the most part contain traits that have patents associated with it. So there are established royalty collection systems for those crops. And you know, others would have numbers at their fingertips about the dollars that go into research and development for those crop types. It significantly exceeds what's invested both publicly and privately on cereals at this point. So, you know, needing to find a way to collect royalties more comprehensively so that the development programs for cereals are sustainable going forward, so that you know, if there are similar levels of investment, then the progress that could be made on developing those value-added varieties would be much, much faster.
One more question before we move on to our final speaker. We don't want a value creation system to just reward developers. It has to provide value to the entire value chain. Is there a way that we can do that, Erin?
Well, if we go back to the concept of innovation and its adoption, unless value is perceived, it's not going to be adopted. And so new varieties have to provide value to growers, or they're not going to be grown. And if they're not grown, there's no royalty collection, and therefore no return to the program. And again, regardless of whether it's public or private or large or small. So it's inherent in developing new varieties that they need to work for the entire value chain, and then also, you know, for the customers of the growers who are producing the crops of those varieties, so that everybody along the chain does benefit.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. We'll now move on to our third and final speaker of the day. Loren Hadley is Executive Director for the Canadian Plant Technology Agency. After establishing Aggenuity Consulting in 2001, Loren has worked with several clients on a national and international level to provide knowledge on seed market regulations, intellectual property, contract considerations, and plant breeders' rights issues. Lorne will talk about how we can use intellectual property tools to protect seed products as we look ahead to coming disruptions of the future. Lorne, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be with you on this important topic. As Erin did, I did take the topic that we're talking about and kind of add my own spin to it. And the first part of this in my presentation is there has to be rewards that innovators can see. There has to be, for lack of a better term, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for being in development. And until we have clarity about receiving that pot of gold, it's going to be difficult. Just to give you a short, CPTA is not that well known. The organization was set up for these purposes, and I've spent the last several years working in there trying to improve the competitive framework for intellectual property in seed in Canada. The first few slides are just to bring you up to date. We're just over coming up on 3-year anniversary of updating our plant breeders' rights laws in Canada. For years, we were on what was known as the 78 Convention. Now we've been able to update to the most modern convention, which is 91. That puts us on equal footing. And the reason that plant breeders' rights is important in this discussion is because plant breeders' rights provides the boundaries for use. And they provide the areas in which use is encouraged of seed and where it's permitted and where it's not permitted. Now, sometimes seed is kind of most of the time seed is kind of a dual product. And the reason I say that is that farmers buy seed because the physical package is something that they need. It's the ability to come out of the ground and establish a crop. But what they're really buying is actually the software of the variety. That software will cause the physical plant to grow appropriately, provide the product they're looking for on their own farms. So keep in mind every time when we talk about this that in some ways the analogy has been made that seed is kind of a product that's both the hardware and the software of a growing plant. The hardware is the capability of the seed to germinate and grow vigorously. The software is actually the instructions for creation of a plant. So why do we think that? Why do we know that the upgrade of our plant breeders' rights law was important? Well, to start with, there is a set of rights that were expanded, and those rights make it more appropriate and easier for the owner of the software to get paid. And under the new act that we have, which is compliant with a number of other countries around the world, the things that you do in preparing the hard package are also now controlled by the owner of the software. So the seed buyer, the processor, all these people are included. We also have a provision that allows us to look after illegitimate use on harvested material. So if someone acquires seed illegally, it ends up in the grain market, and the person selling it into the grain market didn't have a license, we can actually act in the value chain against seed buyer, conditioner, grain processor, and so on. Part of the social license, if you will, of plant breeders' rights that's been well established is that there are restrictions that the software engineer, the plant breeder, has. And these are listed on the screen. The one that I would sort of want to focus on for today's discussion is, there's two actually. The first one is research, breeder's exemption, and the second one is the farmer's privilege. So a breeder's exemption actually plays that once you agree and put a variety in the market under PBR 91, you're actually agreeing that other breeders can work with it. They can put it into their programs, they can put it into systems, and they can work with it. Use the genetic potential within your variety to create new ones. The second one is that Canada chose to have what's known as a farmer's privilege. And that is where a farmer actually buys product legitimately and then is, by the virtue of that purchase, allowed to use it on his own farm and his own production. Now, this is not a normal provision under the Act. It's optional, and the options depend on the crop type and on the country. But not all countries have that, and not all crops have that. So with UPOV coming in place in 91, what it allows us to do is extend the opportunity for collection. And what's disruptive about this is that in the past, innovators had to get their reward essentially from the sale of seed. New plant breeders worked through the distribution chains, sold seed, they got a return from that sale of seed. Under the new system, we can create new models of what is sometimes called royalty collection. And those royalty collection models can be used at various parts. So you can create a royalty collection model that allows you to collect some payment on the use of farm-saved seed. You can create a royalty collection model that would allow you actually to do an acreage payment. You could create a model for royalty collection that collects on production. Those are all available to us. Now, the requirements under law, of course, would be that there'd have to be a contractual agreement where the farmer, in some ways, agrees to surrender his farmer's privilege and has an informed agreement to pay you for the use of his product. What can be disruptive in this sense is that with any of these flexible options of legitimate production, you can actually use verification systems using some of the systems Doug talked about, including things like imaging and drone technology, to actually provide very efficient methods for verification and confirmation of what is owed and what needs to be done. The other thing that's coming up that we haven't talked a little bit about is all of you as retailers that are on the line are involved in agronomic services. Now, if we keep thinking about seed as being something that you're going to use software, then some of the agronomic services that are provided where you used focused application of herbicides, focused and timed application of fertilizer, may be variable depending on which software, which variety you're using. And it provides some opportunity for inputs to be, for lack of a better term, for inputs to be focused to a specific set of software. Now, key to all this legitimate production is retailers' relationship with producers. Regardless of how we look at this, there will be some implications in terms of keeping the key relationship with producers. New funding models are going to have to be explained, how they operate, what their implications are, and it's best done with a direct one-on-one. Mark, I see that Rob's got his hand raised. Do we want to take the question now?
We could. Rob, did you have a question? While we're waiting for Rob, I can proceed to bring up another question that just came in, Lorne. Can you give a recap of how retailers' relationship to the customer is a key success factor in protecting intellectual property?
So I can. Very simply, one of the requirements under intellectual property of all types is informed consent. In other words, the customer has to know when they make a purchase what the terms and conditions are. So retailers have to be very clear when they're selling a seed product to a customer that they actually know the information about the variety and communicate to the producer what the limitations and or what the opportunities are with that variety. So it actually strengthens the retailer relationship, because not only are you giving them the product and software that they need to grow a good crop, you're also providing them with the information to, for lack of a better term, comply. So it's very similar to things like stewardship. So that's legitimate production and the extended rewards. This one is the one that's interesting and provides a fairly new idea in the Canadian system, and that is a system called essential derivation. Now, you heard me say earlier that breeders are allowed to take a new variety and work with it, a protected variety, inside their program. However, under the legislation we have today, there is the responsibility to pay the original innovator if the new variety is not essentially different from when it's introduced. So if we have a new variety called Mark that we introduce on the market, and I come along and I make some significant but minor changes like herbicide tolerance to Mark's variety, I may in fact with Mark wheat herbicide tolerant, I may end up with what's known as a copycat or an essentially derived variety. Under the laws as they exist in Canada, I would be required as the new variety of Mark HT to go back to Mark and essentially pay him for the use of his variety, because my variety could not have occurred without his in large part. This is a fairly new thing. It is very new in Canada, but a fairly new thing, and the exact rules and regulations and how these things work will be determined civilly, and there's still some international work to do. But what it is going to do is increase the diversity. And it also creates an opportunity for retails, because you will essentially have perhaps an increase in analogous varieties where they're very similar, but they have specific uses that are somewhat different. And so the ability to get information to and communicate appropriate and optimal use to a producer becomes quite important. And finally, the question about what we do about infringing production, illegal production, is a big issue, something we worked about a lot. So there's two parts of this. Because we have this extended production right, now everyone that's involved in the processing and using of a protected variety must ensure that what he or she's working with, is legitimate production. The best example of this is that under our present laws that are in place in Canada, if someone delivers what is illegally produced production, in other words, the producer didn't start with pedigreed seed, he bought it from a neighbor, and it's a 1991 variety, and it's delivered into the elevator system, and it's discovered at that point that there's some illegitimate production, the rights holder can actually take action against whomever is in possession of the infringing production. This also allows us to put in what are known as precautionary measures in other countries. So we can actually, if you have protection in Canada and protection in the U.S., and a product moves across the border and shows up in the U.S., if it's illegitimately produced, in other words, the person that has it can't prove that it's produced using certified seed, or someone who has bought certified seed, then you can also take action there. And so this allows us to do that. It also allows us, as a good corporate citizen worldwide, it allows us to actually be very careful in that if there's production coming into Canada, that we make sure that it was produced legitimately outside of Canada in the cases where stuff falls in. So that's the kind of where we're going. I think it's important to understand that we have this new suite of tools, and it's a matter of making everybody responsible. So I want to thank you. That's the basis of my information. Just want to let you know our membership list, and I'll also, before we go to questions, just put out my contact information. I see Rob has asked a question. It is, what are the implications of this in terms of Canada's privacy laws, as multiple players may access data, seed company, retail, agronomist, banker, etc. So just to clarify a bit, Rob, when it comes to privacy laws in Canada, first of all, in general, privacy laws are for personal information. So in many cases, the privacy law occurs, and the way we say this is that if I buy seed from my local retailer has the right to use the information that I bought seed. They just can't tell anybody that I'm married. That's the first principle. The second principle is that you are allowed to use, under privacy law, any information that is required to look after your legitimate right. So if you if I purchase protected seed from a local retailer, it is legitimate for the rights holder of that protected seed to have that information about who bought his product. It's also legitimate for that rights holder to ask questions. It is also legitimate for him to say to, for example, a seed cleaner, so-and-so bought seed from me. He can only clean that seed for use on his own farm. So that's the first part of it, or the second part of it. The second part of privacy, the third part of privacy law is that the main thing that you have to do is you have to inform. So in terms of making a sale, somewhere in the invoice, tag, bag, or policy statement, you put into the producer, your business information about this invoice will be used in these cases, and you list them. So again, it's about informed consent. So I see we have another question. Has Canada developed specific methods to identify EVDs, and have you seen or identified particular problems or complaints with this new regulation? So in the first part, no, at this point, the way we understand the law, because it's pretty new in Canada, is that the minimum distance requirements, which is the genetic distance between varieties, would be determined in a civil basis by civil courts. There are a number of international fora where we're talking about this as the seed industry internationally. What would be probably the most impactful would be dependence. Does a variety depend for its success on the genetic material in a particular previous protected variety? And the best example we have today would likely be where someone takes a variety and makes what is probably be a minor change in sort of genetic total. One of the examples that's always used, of course, is herbicide tolerance, but there may be others. So it hasn't been identified at this time. It's so new that we haven't identified any problems other than the educational part of making sure breeders understand their responsibilities under the new law and trying to get to the point where we're able to definitively measure what genetic distance is using genetic techniques for those things where it's not obvious. So Kurt asks a question, what new technology can we use to disrupt the brown bag seed market? Good question. I think that there are probably three things that are most impactful in that. The first one is that retailers now realizing and communicating with producers that it's not just the seller, but it's those that either buy or assist in the purchase of illegal seed. So, for example, in the case of CPTA, we recommend that retailers who are processing seed, and that's either cleaning and or treating, put in place a work order system where that work order actually says you know that the seed that is being processed by a farmer is actually eligible by him to be used on his own farm. In other words, they have to have proof of purchase. What will happen in the future, I think, is as we get to things like smart contracts, smart labels, perhaps barcoding, we will be able to automate that process where a farmer will come in, the retailer will go on to the database and simply say, you're bringing in X wheat, I see where you made a legitimate purchase. Your farm size is such and such, yeah, this looks reasonable, here's your work order, I think you're okay. So that's an answer to the questions. Are there any others?
If we don't have any other questions, I'd just like to thank you so much for your time, Lorne. That's about all the time we have today, and I just want to thank all three of our speakers, Doug, Erin, and Lorne, for taking the time to join us and share their expertise. As always, thank you, our audience, for participating, and I hope you found this information valuable. Again, I'd just like to thank our sponsors, 2020 Seed Labs, Canterra Seeds, and CCAN for their support. I'd also quickly like to thank our team working behind the scenes for all their hard work in making this a successful event, Kyle Dradawani and Teresa Kurdziewicz. Again, this presentation will be made available online at germination.ca very soon. If anybody does have any additional questions, please feel free to tweet us at Germination. Our handle is @GerminationMag, and I'd love to submit your questions to our speakers and have them answered for you. Again, thank you, and I hope you have a terrific day. This is Mark Zinkowitz of Germination signing off.